Joseph Stalin was one of the most feared rulers the modern world has ever seen. During roughly a quarter of a century in power, he ruled the Soviet Union through fear, punishment, and absolute control. Millions died under his system through famine, executions, prison camps, and purges. People around him learned a terrifying lesson very quickly. Under Stalin, nobody was ever completely safe. Not political rivals, not loyal officials, not soldiers, and not even members of his own family. And still, when he died in 1953, huge crowds mourned him as if they had lost a national hero. That is what makes Stalin so chilling. He was both feared and worshipped, hated and praised, destructive and, to many of his supporters, necessary. Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. Here we learn new ideas and improve our English at the same time through stories. You practice English without feeling like you're studying. So, let us start. He was born as Joseph Vissarionovich Jugashvili on December 18th, 1878, in the small Georgian town of Gori. At that time, Georgia was part of the Russian Empire, so from the start, Stalin was growing up inside a world ruled from far away by the Russian state. His home life was brutal. His father, Vissarion, known as Besso, was a shoemaker, heavy drinker, and violent man. He often stayed away from home for long stretches, but when he did return, he brought fear with him. He beat Stalin's mother, Ekaterina, and he beat young Stalin too. His mother could also be strict and punishing, but she was far more protective and cared deeply about her son's future. So, Stalin's childhood was shaped by violence from both inside and outside the home. Gori itself was a rough place, where fighting in the streets was common and toughness mattered. As a boy, Stalin lived in an atmosphere where force was normal, weakness was dangerous, and fear was part of daily life. One event that seems to have stayed with him happened in 1892, when he witnessed a public hanging of two criminals. He was still young, but scenes like that leave marks. Later in life, he would become a man who used terror in a cold, organized way, and it is hard not to notice how early he was exposed to cruelty as something public and ordinary. Yet alongside all that violence, he also showed strong intelligence. Stalin attended church school and did extremely well. He impressed teachers with his memory and his academic ability, sang in the choir, and graduated ahead of schedule. For a boy from such a hard background, education offered a path upward. In 1894, at around 15 years old, he won a scholarship to the theological seminary in Tiflis, the Georgian capital. His mother hoped religion would give him a stable future, perhaps even make him a priest. But the seminary did not shape him into a man of faith. It pushed him in the opposite direction. Instead of becoming devoted to the Bible, Stalin became more interested in radical political ideas. He started reading Marx and Engels, and the ideas of revolution gripped him far more strongly than religious teaching. He rejected belief, declared himself a Marxist and an atheist, and joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, a movement dedicated to revolutionary change. So even before adulthood, he had already started turning away from the world his mother wanted for him and toward a life built around ideology, power, and struggle. In 1899, he was expelled from the seminary because of those political leanings. That was the real beginning of his revolutionary life. Around this time, he took on the nickname Koba, borrowed from a Georgian folk hero, The kind of outlaw figure who stood tall, fought enemies, and took revenge. It was a revealing choice. Stalin clearly liked the image of strength, defiance, and fearlessness. For the next few years, he worked ordinary jobs on the surface, including a post at the Tiflis Meteorological Observatory, but politics was where his real energy went. He organized workers, helped stir strikes, wrote for socialist newspapers, and learned how to speak in a way that could excite a crowd. In 1901, he moved to Batumi, a port city on the Black Sea where revolutionary activity was growing. There he pushed harder, helping organize unrest at an oil refinery. That led to his arrest, imprisonment, and eventually exile to Siberia. And that first arrest was only the beginning. Over the next 12 years, Stalin was arrested again and again, 6 times in total. But what stands out is that he kept coming back. He escaped exile repeatedly, traveled under false identities, and returned to underground political work almost every time. Those years mattered because they hardened him. They made him more suspicious, more secretive, and more ruthless. Life as a hunted revolutionary taught him not to trust easily and not to hesitate when force was needed. His personal life during this period was also distant and cold. In 1906, he married Kato Svanidze, and the following year they had a son, Yakov. But Stalin was rarely present. He was absorbed in revolutionary work, arrests, escapes, and plotting. Then tragedy struck when Kato died of typhus in 1907, still very young. Stalin was shaken, and at her funeral he reportedly said that she had softened his heart, and that with her death, his last warm feelings for humanity had died too. Whether that was fully true or not, it does fit the path he was already on. He became even more emotionally closed off after that, and his son was largely raised by others. By the early 1900s, the young man once known as Joseph from Gori was becoming something else. He was no longer just an angry, intelligent outsider with revolutionary ideas. He was becoming disciplined, hardened, and dangerous. And soon, he would attach himself to the movement that would change Russia forever. In the early years of the Russian revolutionary movement, Stalin was still not one of its biggest stars. He was not the best speaker, not the most famous writer, and not the most naturally magnetic figure in the room. But he has something else that turned out to matter a great deal. He was patient, disciplined, hard to read, and willing to do the dirty work that others preferred to avoid. That combination made him useful, and in revolutionary politics, usefulness could take a man a very long way. In 1903, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party split into 2 factions, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Stalin sided with the Bolsheviks, the more hardline wing led by Vladimir Lenin. He admired Lenin and quickly threw himself into the cause. He worked against the Mensheviks, helped organize party activity, and took part in criminal operations designed to raise money for the movement. These were not small or symbolic acts. The revolutionary underground often survived through robbery, intimidation, and secret dealing, and Stalin showed that he was perfectly comfortable operating in that world. That caught Lenin's attention. Lenin saw something valuable in Stalin. He reportedly called him the wonderful Georgian, which says a lot about how Stalin was beginning to be viewed inside the movement. In 1912, Lenin appointed him to the Bolshevik Central Committee, which was a major step upward. Around this same time, Stalin dropped the name Koba and adopted the name the world would remember, Stalin, meaning man of steel. It was a powerful bit of self-creation. The name sounded hard, cold, and unbreakable, exactly the image he wanted to project. Then history began moving very fast. The First World War placed enormous strain on the Russian Empire. Military defeats, hunger, economic collapse, and public anger all combined to weaken the rule of Tsar Nicholas II. By early 1917, the old order was cracking apart. On the 15th of March 1917, the Tsar abdicated, ending more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. Russia suddenly entered a period of confusion and instability, with a provisional government trying to run the country while socialist groups, workers' councils, and revolutionary factions all competed for influence. At that moment, Stalin was still in exile in Siberia. But after the revolution broke out, he returned to Petrograd and stepped into a more visible role. He took over editing the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, which gave him influence inside the party. At first, Stalin took a relatively cautious approach. The Bolsheviks were still a minority, and he thought working with the provisional government for a time might help strengthen their position. Lenin hated that idea. When Lenin returned from exile, he blasted the provisional government and called for a far more aggressive line. He thought the revolution had not gone nearly far enough, and he criticized Stalin for being too soft. Stalin adjusted quickly. That was one of his gifts. He was not always the first man to push a line, but he was very good at sensing where power was moving and placing himself on the winning side. Once Lenin made it clear that compromise was out, Stalin hardened his position and fell into line. In July 1917, unrest grew again, and the provisional government cracked down on the Bolsheviks. Some leaders were arrested, while Lenin had to flee. Stalin, still considered fairly unimportant by many outside the party, avoided arrest and helped Lenin go into hiding in Finland. That mattered. In moments of danger, Stalin made himself useful to the most important man in the movement. Then came the final break. Later that year, Lenin returned and pushed for an immediate seizure of power. Some Bolsheviks wanted caution, and interestingly, Stalin at first leaned that way too. But once the decision was made, he was fully on board. In late October 1917, the Bolsheviks overthrew the provisional government and seized control. The revolution that followed would reshape Russia and much of the 20th century. After the takeover, Lenin created the new Soviet government, and Stalin was appointed People's Commissar for Nationalities. It was not the top job, but it was important, especially in a huge empire full of different ethnic groups and competing loyalties. During the civil war that followed, Stalin gained even more power. He was sent to key fronts and given major responsibilities, including the defense of Tsaritsyn, the city that would later be renamed Stalingrad. It was during the Civil War that another important pattern became obvious. Stalin did not handle disagreement well. He often clashed with Leon Trotsky, who was one of the most brilliant and prominent Bolsheviks of the era. Trotsky was a much bigger public figure than Stalin, but Stalin was building strength in a different way. He created networks, rewarded loyalty, and showed a willingness to use extreme methods. One story from this period claims he had a group of Trotsky supporters imprisoned on a leaking barge and left to drown. Whether every detail of that story is exact or not, it captures the reputation he was building, a man who treated enemies with cold cruelty and saw mercy as weakness. By 1922, Stalin's rise had become impossible to ignore. Lenin appointed him General Secretary of the Communist Party's Central Committee. At first glance, That may not have looked like the most glamorous role, but it gave Stalin control over appointments, party structure, and internal organization. In other words, it gave him the machinery of power. And once he got his hands on that machinery, he began using it in a way that few fully understood at the time. Stalin was not yet the unquestioned ruler of the Soviet Union, but he was moving steadily in that direction. He had Lenin's trust, a growing base inside the party, and an instinct for turning bureaucracy into power. The quiet man from Georgia was no longer just serving the revolution. He was positioning himself to control it. By the early 1920s, Stalin had reached the inner core of Soviet power, but he was still not the obvious successor to Lenin. That is important because later it can look as if his rise was inevitable. It was not. Men like Leon Trotsky were much more famous, much more impressive in public, and much more closely associated with the revolution in the eyes of many observers. Stalin's strength was different. He was quieter, more patient, and far more skilled at building control behind the scenes. Still, his relationship with Lenin began to sour. One major reason was Georgia, Stalin's homeland. After the revolution, Georgia had been promised a degree of autonomy, and for a short period it enjoyed a measure of self-rule. But when Lenin decided to pull it back more tightly into the Soviet system, he wanted that process handled carefully. Stalin took a much harsher approach. He crushed resistance and had leading Georgian opponents executed. Lenin was furious, not only because of the brutality itself, but because it showed the kind of man Stalin really was when given authority. Around this same time, Lenin's health began collapsing. In late 1922, he suffered the first of several strokes, and his ability to direct the government weakened badly. That opened a dangerous question inside the Communist Party. If Lenin could no longer lead, who eventually would? Lenin himself became worried about Stalin. In a political testament, he warned that Stalin was too rude and too dangerous to remain general secretary, and he suggested the party consider removing him. That was an extraordinary warning coming from the man who had helped elevate him. The relationship got even worse when Stalin verbally abused Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, over the telephone while Lenin was gravely ill. Lenin was outraged when he learned about it, but by then he was too sick to stop Stalin effectively. When Lenin died in January 1924, Stalin moved fast and very cleverly. He helped organize the funeral, placed himself at the center of the mourning, and presented himself as the loyal guardian of Lenin's legacy. He even helped turn Lenin into an almost sacred figure, with memorials, slogans, and later the renaming of Petrograd as Leningrad. It was a powerful move. Stalin was no longer just a party official. He was remaking himself as the rightful heir to Lenin. That gave him a major advantage in the struggle that followed. His biggest rival was Trotsky, who had led the Red Army and was widely seen as the more brilliant man. But brilliance did not save Trotsky. Stalin used alliances, bureaucracy, and control of party appointments to slowly isolate him. He worked with one faction against another, then shifted when it suited him. In 1925, Trotsky was forced out as People's Commissar for War. By late 1927, open opposition had been crushed, and Trotsky was expelled from the party. He would later be exiled from the Soviet Union altogether. Stalin had won the struggle for power, not in one dramatic moment, but step by step, by making sure his enemies lost ground while he kept tightening his grip. While all this was happening politically, his private life was hardly peaceful. In 1919, Stalin had married his second wife, Nadezhda Alilueva. Together, they had 2 children, Vasily and Svetlana. But this marriage, like much else in Stalin's life, was filled with tension. He could be cold, cruel, and humiliating even with those closest to him. In November 1932, during a celebration marking the anniversary of the revolution, Stalin and Nadezhda argued in front of guests. He reportedly mocked and humiliated her publicly, even flicking cigarette ends at her and addressing her dismissively. The next morning, she was found dead from a gunshot wound. It was ruled a suicide. That moment matters because it shows that Stalin's atmosphere of fear was not limited to politics. It existed inside his own home as well. Even his family lived under the weight of his temper, his coldness, and his power. By the end of the 1920s, Stalin had achieved what he wanted most: near total control of the Communist Party and the Soviet state. But control was not enough for him. He wanted transformation on a massive scale. He wanted to force the Soviet Union into becoming an industrial giant, and he was willing to sacrifice millions of lives to make that happen. That is where the next and even darker phase begins. Once Stalin had pushed aside his rivals, he stopped acting like a party leader among equals and started behaving like a ruler who could remake an entire society by force. In the late 1920s, he brought back collectivization, the policy of forcing peasants to give up their land, livestock, and independence and join state-controlled farms. On paper, this was meant to modernize agriculture and help fund industrial growth. In reality, it turned into one of the most brutal social assaults in modern history. The main targets were the so-called kulaks, peasants, labeled as better off or resistant to state control. Stalin declared that they had to be eliminated as a class. That language mattered because once a whole group is defined as an enemy, cruelty becomes much easier to justify. Villagers were encouraged to denounce neighbors. Armed units moved into the countryside. Families were shot, deported, or sent to labor camps. Others, knowing the state was about to seize everything, slaughtered their own animals and destroyed their own tools rather than hand them over. The result was catastrophe. Agricultural production collapsed, and famine spread across the Soviet Union. Ukraine suffered especially terribly, where millions died in what became known as the Holodomor, or killing by hunger. And what makes this even darker is that the famine was not just a natural disaster or a tragic mistake. The state kept taking grain while people were starving. In some cases, people could be executed simply for trying to keep a handful of food alive for themselves or their children. At the same time, grain was still being exported abroad. So while Stalin spoke about progress, huge numbers of ordinary people were dying in silence. And yet, while the countryside was being broken, Stalin pushed industry at full speed. He launched his 5-year plans, promising to drag the Soviet Union into the modern age. New industrial cities appeared. Factories, mines, rail networks, and power projects expanded at an astonishing pace. In terms of raw industrial growth, the Soviet Union did become a major power. But that success came at an unbelievable human cost. Workers faced impossible quotas, terrible living conditions, and punishment if they failed. By the mid-1930s, Millions had passed through the Gulag system, the vast network of forced labor camps where prisoners built canals, railways, and industrial projects through exhaustion, hunger, and fear. Then came the Great Terror. In 1934, a popular party official named Sergei Kirov was assassinated in Leningrad. To this day, many believe Stalin was behind it, though absolute proof remains debated. What matters is what Stalin did next. He used the murder as the excuse for an enormous purge. New laws stripped people of any real defense. Show trials were staged. Confessions were extracted. Old Bolsheviks, party officials, military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were all swept up. Arrest quotas were set district by district, and local officials were pushed to exceed them. The logic of terror fed itself. People denounced others before they themselves could be denounced. Suspicion became a survival tool. No one could relax, because no one knew where the danger would come from next. Even top military commanders were arrested and executed, badly weakening the Soviet Union just as Hitler's Germany was becoming more aggressive. Entire sections of Soviet society were living under the constant fear of a knock at the door in the middle of the night. This was Stalin at his most terrifying. Not just punishing enemies, but creating a system where fear itself became the normal condition of life. Then, in 1939, with Europe sliding toward war, Stalin made one of the most shocking moves of his career. Instead of joining Britain and France against Hitler, he signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. For the moment, it bought him time, but he badly misjudged Hitler. Stalin convinced himself that Germany would not break its word, even as warning signs piled up. On the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. The attack was devastating. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded. Cities fell quickly. Stalin, who had built his image around strength and certainty, was stunned. For a brief moment, he seemed almost broken. Reports describe him withdrawing to his dacha, shaken and silent, while the leadership around him panicked. But then he returned and took charge again. From that point on, Stalin became the wartime ruler of a country fighting for survival. The cost of that war was almost beyond comprehension. Soviet cities were destroyed, millions of soldiers died, and civilians suffered on an enormous scale. Stalin made ruthless decisions throughout the conflict. Prisoners of war were branded traitors. Retreat could be punished by death. Even his own son, Yakov, when captured by the Germans, was denied special treatment. Stalin reportedly refused to exchange him, and Yakov later died in captivity. That tells you something important about Stalin. Even blood ties meant very little once power and image were involved. And yet, despite his cruelty, Stalin was also the leader who remained in Moscow when the Germans came close, who allied with Churchill and Roosevelt, and who stood at the head of the Soviet war effort as the Red Army slowly pushed Hitler back. By 1945, the Soviet Union had helped crush Nazi Germany, but at a horrifying price. More than 20 million Soviet citizens were dead. After the war, Stalin did not soften. Victory only made him more powerful and, in many ways, more paranoid. Eastern Europe was brought under Soviet control. The Cold War began. Back at home, arrests continued. Suspicion continued, and the cult around Stalin grew even larger. Portraits, praise, ceremonies, and propaganda turned him into something close to a living god. But age was catching up with him. In late February 1953, after a long evening with senior officials, Stalin suffered a major stroke. He died on the 5th of March 1953. Crowds mourned him in overwhelming numbers because many people had truly been taught to see him as the father and protector of the nation. The truth was far darker. Stalin had helped turn the Soviet Union into a world power, but he had done it through terror, famine, camps, executions, and fear on a staggering scale. A few years after his death, Nikita Khrushchev openly admitted that Stalin had committed terrible crimes against the Soviet people. And with that, the carefully built image of the wise and benevolent leader began to crack. What remained was the real legacy, not the myth of a protective father, but the story of one of history's most ruthless dictators. All right, if you made it through this session today, that already says something about your discipline. This repetition and consistency combination might look boring on paper, but it is one of the most powerful ways to build fluent, natural English. Keep showing up like this, and your brain will slowly adapt. Trust the process. If this helped even a little, consider liking the video or subscribing. It lets me know these sessions are actually making a difference. We'll catch up again soon. Take care till then.